Okay, hello everybody. I'm Roger Waldinger, professor of sociology at UCLA and director of the Center for the Study of International Migration. I am delighted to welcome you to today's session, which is one in part of a continuing set of talks on migration that we are organizing with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego. Before we get to today's event, I want to tell you about what's headed your way. Next Friday, we're going to have a discussion of a new, very interesting book called Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrant Inequality in America, written by Susan Eckstein, a professor of sociology at Boston University, with a comment by Cesar Ayala, my colleague in sociology here at UCLA. And then the following Friday, May 20th, we will have a special workshop on government data and migration research, advantages, pitfalls, and examples with Austin Kocher, Caitlin Powtler, Juan Pedrosa, and Alicia Riley. And unlike today's event, that'll be a 2-hour event going from noon to 12. But today I am delighted to welcome our speaker, Jiaqi Liu, who is completing his PhD in sociology at UC San Diego, and who will talk to us on the topic of From Sea Turtles to Grassroots Ambassadors, the Chinese Politics of Outbound Student Migration. Jiaqi will talk for about 45 minutes, I imagine, and then we don't have a commentator, so we will open up directly to questions and answers. Okay, so without any further ado, Jiaqi, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay, hope you can see my screen now. Thank you, Roger, for the introduction. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my research on China's policy toward overseas students. A big shout out to CCIS and CSIM for hosting. This presentation is titled From Sea Turtles to Grassroots Ambassadors, Chinese Politics of Outbound Student Migration. It is based on my recently published article with the same title at International Migration Review, and it is part of my dissertation fieldwork, my dissertation project, which I'm still working on. So I would really appreciate your feedback and comments. First, some background. Global student migration is on the rise. According to UNESCO data, as of 2017, over 6 million tertiary students were studying outside their origin countries. International students exert enormous economic impacts, contributing 45 billion USD to the American economy alone in 2018. On the other side of the migratory channel, China has steadily established itself as the world's largest source country of student migrants since 1998, with the global percentage of Chinese student migrants more than doubling from 7% in 1998 to 17% in 2017. But the enormous size of the Chinese student population abroad is not a historical constant. In 1978, when China began promoting large-scale outbound student migration, it had only 860 overseas students. In less than 4 decades, this number ballooned by 535 times to 460,000 in 2014. Scholars attribute this dramatic growth to a constellation of domestic factors, including the rise of Chinese middle class and the conversion of economic capital into cultural capital, China's competitive domestic education system, the Confucian pursuit of better education, the blockage of commercial education agents, and poor factors in destination countries, such as the commercialization of Western universities and neoliberal labor policies. What is missing from this literature, however, is an analysis of China's policy toward outbound student migration. My research, by examining China, the largest origin country of student migrants in the world, it illuminates how home countries regulate and strategize about overseas students. This research is also personally important to me. I'm a Chinese international student myself. I remember when I was a law student at University of Arizona, a lawyer asked me, why studying law in the US? Are you a spy? He asked half jokingly. In fact, I'm not the only Chinese international student who's facing questions about espionage. Along with China's rise on the global stage, Chinese students have been accused of stealing Western technologies and acting as a long arm of China's intelligence machine into foreign campuses. Despite largely speculative allegations, these widespread suspicions thrust into the international limelight the supposedly close political ties between Chinese overseas students and the Chinese state. In this study, I want to investigate how China positions overseas students and how overseas students themselves react upon these national strategies. I propose two main arguments. First, China's outbound student migration policy serves three objectives: economic, governmental, and geopolitical. These objectives, however, are not set in stone. Rather, their relative significance ebbs and flows depending on the sending country's specific socioeconomic and political conditions. I find that following decades of prioritizing the economic and governmental impacts of student returnees, haigui or colloquially sea turtles, in boosting the domestic economy and maintaining political stability, the Chinese state now gives growing weight to student migrants' geopolitical value as grassroots ambassadors in expanding China's global influence and enhancing national image abroad. This geopolitical reorientation has become particularly salient under the Xi Jinping leadership as China adopts more assertive soft power strategies in pursuit of global supremacy. My second argument stressed that this geopolitics-focused reorientation, however, may not be well received among student migrants nor fully implemented by local officials. Based on grounded empirical research, I shed new light on student migration politics as a contentious field where state ambitions cross-cut individual desires and national grand plans are confronted with flexible local improvisation. Now let's briefly look at the ISM literature. International student migration, or ISM, has long come under spotlight in education and studies, but remains under-researched in migration literature. Existing scholarship identifies four main actors driving the rise of ISM since the mid-20th century: students and their families, Western universities, receiving countries, and the education migration industry. Existing literature, however, is constrained by three limits. First, the prevalent mobilities paradigm emphasizes the neoliberalization of Western higher education and the labor policies that promote ISM. But this emphasis on neoliberalism may run the risk of overestimating the level of deregulation worldwide and ignoring state strategies, especially those of sending countries in managing ISM. In my research, I bring the state back in by refocusing on how both the central government and the local governments in the sending state strategize about ISM. Second, due to the deeply entrenched immigration bias, ISM studies focus on receiving countries and Western universities. Without sending countries' perspective, we have only a partial picture of international students in and out migration as a continuous transporter process. In this study, I push sending states to the center of analysis. Third, ISM studies over-focus on how international students integrate into Western labor markets or return to home countries after graduation. But how do sending countries perceive international students while they are studying abroad? To answer this question, I examine ISM through the lens of diaspora politics. Now you may wonder, how can ISM be incorporated into diaspora politics? After all, there's a temporal difference between student migrants and diasporas. While student migrants entail a relatively temporary status oriented toward a specific educational purpose, diaspora denotes long-term emigrants who maintain close social, economic, and political bonds with their homeland. However, student migrants are versatile figures who not only build ties with the broader destination society, but also maintain transborder connections with homeland communities. Furthermore, diaspora scholars have shifted the analytical focus toward the social political construction of diasporas for strategic goals. These conceptual connections between ISM and diaspora allow for critical rethinking of ISM through the lens of diaspora politics in sending countries. I theorize that ISM can serve three vital domestic and international aims for sending states, namely economic, governmental, and geopolitical. First, ISM yield bountiful economic benefits for sending countries. Student migrants can make direct economic contributions through financial remittances from their post-graduation employment. They can also promote quote-unquote brain circulation in the forms of technology transfer, entrepreneurial partnering, and return migration. Second, student migration policies may also seek to produce governmental effects in maintaining domestic stability and regime hegemony. This occurs when home countries are concerned about overseas students' foreign exposure and strive to repress students' potential anti-regime activities. Meanwhile, home states can also co-opt foreign educated elites back into the bureaucracy and reproduce the political rule. Third, sending countries may also seek to strengthen geopolitical influence in destination countries through overseas students. For example, the US and Australian governments launched the Fulbright program and a Colombo plan, respectively, first to counter the Axis propaganda threats, and then to extend their geopolitical influence through education aids as soft diplomacy. I will show through a case study of China that these diverse interests are giving changing significance in different political and historical contexts and by different parties that involve in ISM. To illustrate these arguments, I draw on a case study of China conducted in Wuzhe County in summer 2019. Wuzhe is a pseudonym. It is a prominent hometown of overseas Chinese and a community of origin for a growing number of overseas students. Following interviews with the migration officials who organized state-run volunteer retreats for overseas students, they invited me to participate in 3 such events. Here is a photo of us visiting a village in the mountains. I'm the second person on the left. Each retreat lasted approximately 5 days and included 10 to 20 overseas student participants and 1 or 2 bureaucrat guides. Student participants were registered undergraduate or graduate students at European and North American universities. They ranged in age from 19 to 31. This age group is representative of most student migrants from China. All costs associated with the retreats were fully covered by organizing entities. I carried out over 100 hours of participant observation in these retreats over July and August 2019. The summer retreats provided an ideal lens to closely examine the quotidian operation of ISM policy in China. Within a month after the retreats, I conducted 15 in-person interviews with student participants in Wuzhe County. I also interviewed 12 bureaucrats interviewees. In these semi-structured interviews, I probed how student participants and frontline bureaucrats made sense of the retreats and more broadly, China's ISM policy. Now, before we dive in, some historical background. Before the 20th century, China mostly received rather than sent large numbers of student migrants due to its cultural hegemony in Confucianism and economic power in global trade. It was not until the late 19th century, when China's imperial order was on the verge of collapse, that the wobbly Chincourt sent students to Japan, Europe, and the United States. Of the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, China sent students to the Soviet Union and other communist allies. China believed that overseas students could bring back advanced technological and ideological know-how to revitalize the Chinese economy. Nonetheless, this economy-oriented student migration policy was checked by the nascent socialist regime's deep governmental concerns. For example, after the Cultural Revolution broke out in 1966, outbound student migration ceased altogether, and overseas students were ordered to return for ideological struggles. And a dramatic shift came in 1978 when the new national leader, Deng Xiaoping, prioritized educational reforms as a harbinger of his all-out modernization project. Under Deng's developmentalism, student migration was seen as a crucial catalyst for China's economic takeoff. The state promoted outbound student migration for economic reasons, and ISM boomed in its post-socialist China. However, without ideological constraints abroad, student migrants developed their own political opinions, some of which ran counter to the Communist Party of China, or CPC. For example, during China's student movements for democracy in 1989, overseas students protested across the West against the party state. They also helped student movement leaders escape and seek asylum abroad. In response, the Chinese government reprioritized the governmental objective to maintain regime stability and contain overseas students and security threats. Since then, China has tried to balance economic and governmental goals when reaching out to students abroad. In 2004, the Communist Party of China issued its first specific policy on conducting ideological and political work with overseas students. But you can see here, the emphasis still lies in promoting patriotism. Overseas students were encouraged to promote the peaceful unification of mainland China and Taiwan. The geopolitical goal behind ISM was still in its infancy. In the early 2010s, after Xi Jinping rose to power, the geopolitical reorientation of China's ISM policy was accelerated. In the 2013 conference, Xi expressed his quote-unquote hopes for overseas students to help China wield stronger geopolitical influence abroad as grassroots ambassadors. Transcending the innocent figure of students, this labeling grassroots ambassadors delegates student migrants more responsibility in China's soft power network and assertive pursuit of global ascendancy. More importantly, return migration is no longer a precondition. New state policies believe that overseas students can also serve state interests when they are studying abroad. The remoted state-student relations during students' studies abroad, rather than following their post-study return, establish close linkage between ISM policy and China's diaspora politics. My interviews with migration bureaucrats in Wuzhe County, however, painted a very different picture. Local bureaucrats were less interested in the broader geopolitical strategies. They told me that geopolitics are something that only national policy makers should be concerned. In contrast, local officials were more eager to extract economic value from international students. This economic motivation was driven by local government's so-called scramble for talent to stay economically competitive many local governments in China try to entice student returnees with preferential treatment in social welfare and citizenship benefits so that they could outperform other localities in human capital. In my interviews, bureaucrats analogize their policy toward student returnees as, quote unquote, brokering the coupling between brains and deep pockets. What is even more concerning for migration officials at the time of my fieldwork was overseas students' potential security threats. In summer 2019, university students led Hong Kong citizens in mass protests. They opposed the introduction of a controversial extradition bill that would allegedly jeopardize the territory's judicial independence from mainland China. A bureaucrat interviewee told me that young students' active participation in pro-democracy campaigns had sparked the state's serious concerns. The state worried that these youth movements may spill over from Hong Kong onto mainland China. Therefore, bureaucrat interviewees expressed stronger enthusiasm for ISM policy's economic and governmental effects. Contrary to national policies, geopolitical reorientation, local officials showed little interest in pursuing China's broader geopolitical goals. The contrast between national policies and local practices was even more telling in state-organized summer camps for overseas students. These retreats bore resemblance to the diaspora tourism organized in Israel, Morocco, and Scotland. But the three summer camps that I observed were more political and ideological in nature. The paramount theme of all three summer camps was red tourism. This is a particular form of tourism in China. The state promotes tours to revolutionary sites commemorating the party's heroic figures and victorious events. To set the tone, each retreat began with a visit to a red museum. For example, we visited the August 1st Nanchang Uprising Memorial on the exact date of August 1st, 2019. The purpose was to commemorate the 92nd anniversary of the birth of the CPC armed force. All participants were required to wear red t-shirts with the CPC's hammer and sickle emblem. On these t-shirts, there was also the English caption of, quote unquote, stay calm and believe in communism. In other museums, we were asked to perform a myriad of patriotic rituals, such as giving 490-degree bows to a tomb where a famous CPC general was buried, singing red songs, and sending flowers to a monument of martyred CPC soldiers in the anti-Japanese war. In addition to party ideologies, summer retreats also sought to present a positive image of China vis-a-vis its allegedly negative media representation in the West. We visited numerous pristine mountains and heritage villages, learned the traditional 7-string musical instrument of guqin, practiced an Asian physical exercise, and ate fresh local cuisines in 5 restaurants. In the quote I show here, a student interviewee keenly pointed out the rationale behind these arrangements, namely to ask student participants to promote China abroad in the exact same way China was presented to them. Student participants, however, had conflicting views about these retreats. Most students signed up for these retreats only because everything was free. In comparison, the political messages of the retreats were better received among student participants who intended to return to China after graduation, especially those who plan to join the Chinese state bureaucracy. Some student interviewees told me that they were actually quite familiar with this kind of political indoctrination throughout their upbringing. It's just how things work in China, an interviewee said to me indifferently. In contrast, occasionally student participants openly expressed their disaffection. For instance, we visited a museum that celebrated the so-called international friendship showcased by local villagers who saved the life of a Japan-bound American pilot near the end of World War II. Few student participants were interested in the exhibition, and most participants were lining up to play an entertainment flight simulator. Preoccupied with maneuvering a crash landing in World War II, they appeared aloof to the villagers' proclaimed courage and international solidarity on display, not to mention their designed geopolitical role as quote-unquote grassroots ambassadors. Personal leisure and entertaining desires outweigh the political agenda through these mundane interactions between overseas students and the Chinese state. To conclude, the study approaches international student migration, or ISM, from the perspective of diaspora politics. I propose that ISM policy can serve three policy objectives for sending countries: economic, governmental, and geopolitical. However, these interests are not set in stone. Rather, their significance changes depending on the specific conditions of domestic, economic, geopolitical contexts, as well as local state interests. Although Chinese international students are increasingly questioned by Western governments and media for their alleged ties with the Chinese government in recent years, I find that student migrants themselves may not always agree with China's ISM repositioning. For future research, we may dig deeper into student migrants' own agential responses. How do students themselves perceive and reconcile with the rising conflict between homeland China and Western host countries? Moreover, due to travel restrictions and changing economy, ISM has transformed during the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, Chinese international students have been caught in the political crossfire between China and many Western countries. They were blamed as so-called China virus and who spread virus and from homeland China to Western countries. When Chinese students seek to go back to China, to their home countries, they're also blamed as spreading the virus from thousands of miles away. So, given the transformations during the pandemic, how have students' relations with the homeland evolved? And what can we imagine their relations to continue to evolve in the post-pandemic era? In the end, I want to emphasize that migration studies should pay more attention to ISM. While existing studies follow the mobilities paradigm to paint a picture of highly mobile students flowing around the world, we may explore the conditions that actually constrain the transporter journeys. Migration scholars may also examine the role of sending states in facilitating, constraining, or repositioning ISM in their national strategies. Thank you so much for attending and listening. Again, this presentation is based on my recent publication at the International Migration Review. You're welcome to check out the paper. If you don't have access, welcome to reach me by email or get connected on Twitter. This is part of my dissertation research, so I really look forward to your questions and comments in the Q&A. Thank you. Do I stop sharing now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Jiaqi, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. All right, so why don't we now open up to discussion. If you would just use the raise hand function, and then I will call on you. If you prefer, you could just send me a question in the chat. So who would like to begin? Okay, Min, please. Min Jo.
Hi, Jiaqi.
Hi.
Good to hear from you. Good job. So I have a quick question about in the United States, because of the worsening US-China relations, right? The students are kind of in a very anxious and awkward state when they are trying to voice their nationalism and also their sentiment towards China, and then also certain concern about returning to China. So in your research, do you have room to address that?
The rising US China tensions and how these affect international students?
Yeah,
yes, certainly.
Yeah, because on the one hand, the students, are very nationalistic, especially the younger students in the recent years, right? And then and that's along with China rising. And then on the other hand, some of the students may be thinking about being transnational rather than return, being a sea turtle. At least they would stay in their host country for longer. By the way, the U.S. the Department of Homeland Security just extended the practical training from 1 year to 3 years. So you would imagine a lot of Chinese students would stay to gain more experience before they can think about returning. So with this diaspora politics and geopolitical politics going on, how are the students feel and what kind of impact on the students themselves regarding on their return or stay or their kind of national identity formation?
Yes, thank you for this question. So I'm actually doing another project interviewing Chinese students about their attitude towards the US and China during the pandemic. What I found was actually for a lot of STEM major and PhD students, the pandemic hasn't influenced much about their mobility or immobility, because even before the pandemic, the US-China tensions had already constrained their mobility. They didn't plan to go back to China during their whole stay in the US because the visa they got, the F1 visa they got was only valid for 1 year. And after that, they had to reapply and they will be checked. So most of PhD students in STEM majors didn't plan to go back to China during 5 or 6 years of their PhD studies. And as for their post-PhD plans, most of them actually continued their previous plan to stay in the US, find a job, and after accumulating some experience and capital, they'll probably go back to China. So the pandemic hadn't changed much these PhD students in STEM majors, how they envision their futures. But for undergraduate students and a lot of master's students, I find that they actually have very, very complex relations with the US and China, and given all the changes that occurred during the pandemic. And a lot of them had to go back to China. Based on my study, 70% of my undergrad interviewees had at least went back to China once, and many of them actually were still stranded in China because of all the immigration restrictions that were imposed during the Trump administration. Although these restrictions were loosened during the current administration, many of them still fear about their future, about their safety, and so on. So I guess when we talk about Chinese international students' relation with their host and home countries, we actually may have to dig deeper into different populations within this very heterogeneous group of international students. Different students in different age groups and in different majors may have very different perceptions and also plans. But I will continue observing how international students react and to these changes.
Okay,
Thank you.
great, thank you. Other questions? Well, okay, while people are thinking, let me ask a question. I mean, should we really be surprised by what you're finding, especially the reports from the summer camp? I mean, you know, as you point out, these types of summer camps, it's not unique to China. I mean, you mentioned Israel, Morocco, and we know from the research that's, for example, there's a fair amount of research that's been done on the Birthright Israel summer program for, you know, oriented mainly towards younger American Jews to try to interest them in Israel or become more sympathetic to Israeli policy. You know, people go for a variety. It's a free trip. It's fun. So yes, you know, you're exposed to propaganda, but these are young people who are, you know, they've got a free ride and they're with other people their own age, and so, you know, there is a mixture of motivations that are leading them to go on this trip, and I suppose the ones who I mean, the people who would be most oppositional would be unlikely to go to begin with. So yes, you know, they're going to attract people who might have some level of receptivity, but you know, these are not people who are 100% political and have lots of motivation. So is it really a surprise that you find that they're exposed to all of this propagandistic activity, but at the same time, many of them look at it in a very cynical way, that, you know, we're just being pushed, this line is being pushed on us, but it's not necessarily consistent with our own preferences, our own sense of what's best, what's in our interest. So should we, and how, I mean, and I guess the related question is, if these aren't terribly effective ways of changing people's minds, what's the relevance for the experience after student migration, when the students are, let's say, are on American campuses, but when, as we were also discussing before the meeting, when they're under supervision or at least some degree of scrutiny by the consulate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mentioned about the comparison with birthright programs in Israel, but what really surprised me was that the Chinese summer retreats were not really targeted to diasporic youth, namely second or third generations of Chinese migrants, but they were actually targeting Chinese students abroad who actually grew up in China and who are Chinese, right? And they know China by their heart. They're Chinese. They were attracted to these programs only because they've spent some years abroad studying in Western universities. And China was concerned about these students' ideological leaning. So they organized these trips to kind of indoctrinate them. And students, of course, have very different ideas. That's why when I interviewed these migration bureaucrats, they told me about these summer retreats, I was totally amazed. Really, they have special programs for overseas students and everything's free. Because to me, we are all Chinese. We don't really need to take summer retreats to know about China. We're Chinese ourselves. Apparently, the local state was concerned about our ideological changes, and we became somebody who have to be re-educated through these summer camps. And a key difference between the summer camps that I observed and other diaspora and tourism programs in other homeland countries was that overseas students haven't even become diaspora yet. Most of them were abroad for very temporary purpose and to study. And a lot of them actually plan to go back to China after graduation. So why China organize a diaspora type of tourism program for non-diaspora program, for non-diaspora population? That really interested me. And during the field work, I found that students actually had very different ideas about their relations with the homeland, and that depends a lot on their post-graduation and plans, whether they want to go back to China, whether they want to stay abroad. And to a lot of them, they were actually very familiar with it. And a lot of them actually hate it because they already had enough, but they had to go through that again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me see one thing. Let me just change my view so I can see whether there are other questions. So at the moment, I don't see any hands up.
Oh, there are two questions. One from Qing.
Well, there's one question here. Alexis Collis, based on your study, do you think that the worsening relations between China and the US could potentially affect the students who return to China and their opportunities to get jobs?
Yes, that's a great question. I interviewed a lot of students who were affected when they were studying abroad in the US, and even after they go back to China, they still face a lot of questions. During the pandemic, they were questioned by people around them. For example, a lot of students told me that people were worried about them carrying a virus from the US and spread the virus in China. A lot of them and face all kinds of questions about their relations with China and with the US. I remember one student who studied business in the US and went back to work for some technology companies in China. She told me that her relations with the US were actually kind of checked during the interview process, because that technology company has some US business, and given the rising US-China tensions, this company may face some challenges by the US government. So they were actually very careful and when choosing students with US backgrounds. And I don't think this gonna change in the near future. The opportunities to get jobs were probably very good because they have all these foreign credentials. But US education in particular may get them into trouble. So I can see a lot of students choosing other destinations such as the United Kingdom, Canada, to kind of downplay their future employers' concerns and to increase their opportunities to get jobs.
Okay, David Fitzgerald.
Yes, thanks very much. I have a question about whether or not the government, the Chinese government at the national or the local level, has different kinds of policies towards students who go to these different destinations that you just mentioned. So are there different policies targeting students who've gone to the US versus the UK versus France versus Australia or somewhere else? And relatedly, are there examples of large-scale Chinese student migrations to countries that have a friendlier relationship with the PRC government?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me think about. I don't think they really distinguish the destination country, but the US in particular can get these students into a lot of trouble. I can't think of any examples in which the Chinese government actually distinguish students from different and coming back from different countries. I guess their policies is not very fine-tuned to China's changing relations with different countries, because even more neutral countries like Canada and Australia actually and China's relations with Australia and Canada also worsening, and UK is probably better And a lot of Chinese students are thinking about Singapore because it's more neutral and it has a closer political and background with the Chinese system. So I can't really think of any Chinese state policy that actually distinguish students.
Okay. Other questions? All right. Well, let me ask one more question, and then if there are no further queries, we'll bring the session to a halt. I'm looking at a report that was issued by ProPublica at the end of last year, and so ProPublica is a pretty liberal think tank, and so the title is "Even on U.S. Campuses, China Cracks Down on Students Who Speak Out." And it's quite well documented report. So how prevalent do you think these practices are, or how deep do you think the scrutiny is by Chinese officials of what students are doing in the US? And what do you think is going to be, what do you think is going to be the impact on Chinese students of the perception that, I think the spying, I'm pushing a little bit too far, but simply that the students are, at least some of the students are in some ways or another agents or acting on behalf of the Chinese government, and are acting on behalf of the Chinese government that's antithetical to what are standard campus university academic norms?
Yeah. As we chatted before the talk, there are a lot of Chinese scholars and student associations across American university campuses. A lot of these association members actually kind of shoulder responsibility of reporting certain irregular activities if they spot one. For example, I was told that there was going to be some activities relating to Falun Gong, which is a banned religious cult in China, on UCSD campus, and one of the Chinese Scholars and Students Association at UCSD actually reported this event to the Chinese consulate, and they organized a kind of similar activity on this exact same day. And on campus to kind of protest and organize against the Falun Gong event. And I would imagine that and these association members will probably also show the responsibility if they spot something the Chinese students want to organize against the Chinese government. We can see a lot and during the pandemic when and Western countries accused China of spreading the virus or even creating the virus. And in the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of Chinese students organized to defend China, to show that China is actually doing very well in containing the pandemic, and it is the Western government who's allowing the virus to spread across the world. So. And as we chatted a lot already, these associations also played important roles in sending all kinds of health packages sent by the Chinese consulates to Chinese students. So they actually work very closely with the Chinese government, and that's a concern. For a lot of Western universities and Western countries. I don't really have concrete evidence how the Chinese government scrutinized Chinese students on Western campus. But I guess they're also doing that through the Chinese Scholars and Student Association. And of course, students on Western campuses have very different opinions about China. Some of them are very pro-China, very nationalist, as Ming already pointed out. but some of them may also go against China. But based on my personal observation, the latter group wouldn't be so active on campus, while it is the Chinese Scholars and Students Association who's more proactive and publicly openly promoting Chinese interests.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions at the moment. So in that, consequently, well, why don't we bring today's session to an end? I want to thank Jiaqi for a terrific presentation, and I look forward to reading further installments from your dissertation. I want to remind everyone we will meet again next Friday at 12 o'clock for a discussion of a new book called Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrant Inequality in America. Okay, everyone, thank you so much. Have a good weekend, and looking forward to seeing you at another one of our events. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again, Jiaqi.